welcome to you all, whether you're watching this live or recording at some other point, and whether you're in Durham, as I know some of you are, or somewhere else in the world. And I understand the audience is very widespread, so you're all most welcome. And it is a real pleasure to me to be talking to you in Durham. I can just imagine Durham as a backdrop to some of you at least. I had a very, very wonderful time in Durham, and I'll say a bit more about that as I go through. It's quite a number of years now since I was there, but I still feel it's a very, very important part of my life. And somebody once said to me, they have never met anybody who loved their time at university as much as I did. So there must be something very powerful about Durham that's kind of kept resourcing me throughout my entire life. And in fact, I was just saying to Chantal, I'm married to a fellow Durham graduate. We did our very best for about the whole of our time at Durham to avoid each other. Not really, but we didn't meet for many years later, and then we finally did get together. But it's one of those many Durham relationships that I'm very pleased to say has lasted. So a great pleasure to be with you. I'm just going to share my screen now, and I have got some slides to have as a backdrop for our talk this evening. Great. I hope you can all see those. So I did an English degree at Durham, and that lovely picture of the castle there was one of the ones, like all of you I'm sure enjoy wandering around Palace Green. And then I will say more about how I got to where I am now, leadership development consultant and executive coach. But my intention really for today is that you go away from tonight with something that's of value to you. I know you're all in some sort of leadership role, whether in a club or society, and some of you may have aspirations for that going forward in your careers as well. So I hope that's something that you can take away, but also just for you and your interactions with people right now. Some of the things I'm going to share, particularly around learning from neuroscience, I hope you will find will be helpful to you going forward. So as I say, I will talk for a chunk of time, and then I will pause. I will come out of the slides, and then we'll have an opportunity if anyone's got any questions at that point, and then I'll carry on with the slides, and at the end we'll have another longer time for any questions and answers. Thank you. So I couldn't resist putting together a little slide with the Durham Light Festival. I imagine some of you went there last November. It was the first time I'd ever actually been, and I was just blown away. I thought it was fantastic. It was an appalling night in terms of weather, so wet and windy, but that didn't really get in the way of the beauty and the incredible creativity of the artists who put together all those exhibits. And the one on the bottom right, I Love Durham, I thought that really summed it up for me. I went with my husband, and we both agreed that that was a very appropriate one. So just couldn't resist putting together a few pictures of Durham, just to remind me of where I had been, and obviously to reconnect with all of you. Just a brief look at the agenda then for this evening. Just wanted to sort of say, and it'll sort of come throughout really, how I see Durham as very much a lifelong resource. It is remarkable really how important a part it has played, not just in those 3 years I was there, but really ever since. I'm just going to give you some highlights, some key points of my career in brief, and then share some of my key lessons, because very much it's an ongoing journey of development for me. And I think leadership really is, you never actually get there. There is no sort of final point to say, right, now I'm the fully rounded leader. It's about being sufficiently open to learning to keep on developing. I think that's what makes the best leaders. I'm going to talk about applying neuroscience to leadership development. So basically the recent learnings about the brain and the nervous system. I'm not a neuroscientist, I should say that up front. I've read a lot about it, but I've also done a qualification in applied neuroscience. And I'm just really fascinated about how neuroscience can be applied to so many fields, but for me of particular interest is the application to my field of leadership development. Now I'm aware that some of you may actually be studying neuroscience and may know a lot more than I do about some of the very detailed science. So what I'm just offering is really the application piece to leadership development, and indeed to life in general, to interaction with humans, with people. I find it really very helpful, much more broadly than just leadership development. I would also encourage you to reflect on your own insights and maybe some actions you might want to take from this evening. I think the best learning happens when we apply it to our own situation. So as you go through this, you might find there are a few points that resonate. So I just encourage you to think about that and maybe jot them down. And then have a chance to think after this, what actions will you take? What might be useful, perhaps in your leadership roles? How might this help you? And as part of this application piece, I'm very conscious that we're all living in very strange times at the moment. And some of the points we talk about, maybe it's about resilience, about communication, some of those things might particularly resonate right now. So I'd encourage you to think about what you can take away and apply pretty swiftly from this evening. And then finally, as I mentioned, we're going to have a question and answer session when you have a chance to ask any questions that arise from this evening that strike you. Okay, so I'll take you back to these photos. I'm not sure about my hairstyle as I look at that one. On my graduation day, this was taken on Palace Green against the wall there. Again, probably a very familiar backdrop to you. Yes, I don't quite know what I was doing with that hairstyle, but you know, there was I proudly wearing my gown as you know, all Durham graduates do. And just a little bit along there, we had all our degree results put up. I think you get it a little bit more privately now, but we had all ours lined up in firsts, 2-1s, 2-2s, thirds, all publicly for everyone to go and see. So we sort of go along there and then scamper away. So nowadays the individual communication is probably a little bit easier to bear if you didn't get quite what you want, but that's how we got it. And then the other picture on the right is me actually receiving my degree certificate. And our Vice Chancellor was Dame Margot Fontaine, the very famous ballerina. And that felt like a real honour to have her award me my degree. I was the last degree ceremony of the Wednesday afternoon, so I still remember it. We went across then to the cathedral, and she gave a speech in the cathedral. And I still remember the 3 things that she said. She said, show tenacity. That was one thing that really struck with me. I actually determined that I would iron her words into my mind. Show tenacity, travel the world, and remember that Durham is always here. And those 3 have been quite important to me. You know, over my life, I've tried to be tenacious as and when it's been needed. I've certainly travelled and have had great pleasure doing so. Obviously, right now I can't. In fact, right now I was supposed to be originally in Rome, and then we decided that Italy wasn't looking very good, and then secondly Cornwall, and then we had to not to travel there. So I have tried to take the travel advice from Dame Margot seriously, but obviously in current times have had to manage that slightly differently. But the piece about Durham is always here. We do. My husband and I, David and I, go to Durham whenever we can. That's not terribly often because obviously life is busy, but we do go, and we've taken the children here, and it's you know, still a great pleasure and a great resource. So I think that just one very small piece, you know, when it comes to your graduation, just try and remember what the speaker says, because actually in the excitement of the day, it's very easy not to remember. It's very easy just to be sort of there, and that's great too, just to kind of experience it all, but to hang on to something. And I made a point also, you know, my son's graduation a few years ago, I actually don't remember what they said, but I did remember at the time, and I did suggest to him that he remembered. But this, I think it's going to be quite powerful as an ongoing resource for you. And I've certainly found that Dame Margot, Durham, my graduation and everything has carried on being important to me. So what am I doing right now? Well, right now, as Chantal said, I'm a leadership development consultant and an executive coach. And the logo on the right there is the logo for my business, Thinking Choices. And I'll say a little bit more about why I called it Thinking Choices in a little while. And on the left, Durham Cathedral, it's really intended to indicate that I'm actually also working part of my time with the Church of England. So I'm a leadership development consultant there with the church, helping to develop leaders there. But also I work the rest of my time with other organisations, whether that be law firms, banks, charitable organisations, not-for-profits, a whole range of different types of organisation, which has given me quite a rich insight to leadership development. And what is very interesting is how of course different the contexts are, but how similar many of the issues that the leaders face, both the actual inner work of being a leader. How do they need to show up as a person, but also some of the issues and how they need to communicate, how they support their teams, etc., how they lead. And so as we speak, you may, those of you who are leading organizations, or I should say clubs or societies, just think about how what I say may be applicable. Some of it may not be, but what may be applicable to your own circumstances. So that's what I'm doing right now. And this is just a little collage, really. I thought, how do I represent visually some of the places I've worked in, the sort of sectors? And I thought this might be a good way of doing it. So when I left Durham, I started off actually and did teacher training. I went to Southampton University. And so at the top, you can see in the green there, teacher training. I had always planned to be a teacher, but quite soon actually realized that I didn't want to be a teacher. I carried on with the teacher training. And then I thought, oh, now that's interesting. I have no idea what I want to do. But I then went into banking. I joined Lloyds Bank there on the left in blue, banking. And actually, pretty soon, as soon as I could, I moved into human resources and learning and development type roles. And actually what has been clear to me, there's been a strand throughout my whole career of developing people. I decided I just wanted adults rather than small people, rather than children. And so once I got into the learning and development space, I just absolutely loved what I did there. And so there's been a huge amount of that within my career. So after about 7 years at Lloyds, I then went to what was Coopers & Lybrand, which then got taken over by PwC, and then so became PwC, which you'll be familiar with, PricewaterhouseCoopers. And there's that big black line there, management consultancy. It was quite exciting because when the merger was first announced, I was actually in Barcelona on an away weekend with the change management community. So I was part of Coopers & Lybrand's human resources and change management consultancy team. And so here this was being announced, a merger, real change management on our doorstep between Pricewaterhouse and Coopers & Lybrand. And we thought, oh, this is going to be fantastic. We can use all our change management skills. And obviously only a subset of people actually did get to work on that. But it was a really exciting time to be with a lot of other change managers because we, as you can imagine, we were brainstorming all sorts of plans. And that was really interesting. And that was really where I first came across coaching, because I could see where the leaders who were most successful at managing large change programs were those who actually worked on their own leadership skills, those who had their own coach. And so that was a really powerful insight. And I thought, right, that's what I want to learn. I want to add that skill set to coaching, which I then subsequently did. And that really is a quite interesting insight. I mentioned a moment ago about the inner work of being a leader. And I think it's really important. People see us as who we are, how we show up. And it's really important to be authentic. You can't for long pretend to be something as a leader. You can certainly show your best attributes, but actually there's something about being accessible and open and authentic that's really important. And if there are areas of yourself that you feel a bit vulnerable on or not sure about, it's really helpful to work with a coach to on those. But it's also helpful to work with a coach to how you can do more of what makes you great. So how can you really show up in the best way possible? So that was where I came across coaching, and there's been a strand of coaching and consultancy throughout the rest of my work. And so some of the smaller bits of writing, you see law firms, United Nations. So that means I've worked with people who've worked in law firms and the United Nations. Fascinating insights one gets as a coach, a real privilege to understand a particular world that you haven't ever been in before. And that's the beauty of being a coach. You're not there in terms of giving advice. Your skill set is to help the person to think through things. So one doesn't have to have done the role or indeed worked in that sector before, but the expertise is providing a framework for leadership development. You'll see there the Lloyds insurance market, because as well as actually coaching people there, I also did a spell working with one of the organizations within the Lloyds market. And that was really interesting, learning about insurance, so banking and insurance. And so you can see I've had quite a broad range of different types of sector, which has been a real privilege and fascinating. So some very interesting differences, but as I said before, some similarities. So that's a brief overview of where I have worked and where I continue to work, because one coachee that I might work with is worked in one sector and one elsewhere. So all the time I'm being invited into other people's worlds. So this is a couple of photos of me public speaking. So another strand that's been part of my role has been speaking. So whether that be running sessions, as in the picture on the left, interestingly talking there about evolutionary brain development, as part of a talk about the application of neuroscience. And then on the right, I was the chair of a conference, High Potential Talent, a few years ago. And I was doing a welcome speech there. So quite a lot of speaking. And over recent weeks, as we were touching on earlier, speaking has been through this dear Zoom. I think Zoom is our new best friend. And obviously it's a different means from being in the room together, and it lacks some of that interaction. But actually it is so much better than not being able to communicate at all. And so it's been really great learning new skills. And I think that whole piece about learning as you go is really key. So public speaking, and I know that's something you at university learn to do, and I think that's a fantastic skill, because in almost every sector of work and well beyond work, the ability to stand up and speak in front of people is really key. So I would take any opportunities you can, and don't worry if you're not fantastic at it right now. Keep on practicing and get better, and seek feedback, and that's an area that you can continue to work on. It will be really worth the investment. So let's look now at some of my key lessons throughout my career. One of them is the importance of managing relationships. Again, this is true, isn't it, in life generally? And that's been so important at work as well. And that's managing work relationships with colleagues, up the line, down the line, with peers, with clients, with suppliers, everybody. The ability to get on with people authentically is really key. Resilience is another area. Dame Margot called it tenacity, which is quite similar, or it's certainly a related area. And the ability to kind of stick at things and to deal with things and to bounce back at times of difficulty is important, because obviously sometimes career paths, don't necessarily go as you would want to. You may not get promoted. For example, when I was at Lloyd's, I had hoped to get a manager role at a certain point. It didn't happen, but actually I thought, okay, what do I learn from this? How can I take a different tour, different route, which I then did. So actually it's having that open-mindedness to learn to do things differently. And taking a positive mindset, that's another really key thing that's been important to me, because we can always choose whether we're going to look at something glass half full or glass half empty. And actually I've tried to take the glass half full approach. What can I learn from this? What might be good from this? How might this help me? And I think that allows us to be much more resourceful. And when we talk about the brain in a minute, we'll find that in fact that's very, very helpful. We're much more creative when we're being positive. I've also noticed the importance of feedback, and that is both welcoming unsolicited feedback, but also seeking it. It can seem counterintuitive, because for many people, feedback means someone's going to tell you what you didn't do well. Now, I think feedback is also very much about what you do well. And actually, it's making sure we ask for that. What am I doing so far that's working for you? Or what was good about that, as well as what could be done better. And in fact, I found that if you ask people for feedback, they are much more willing to give it to you if you ask them for a balance, because it's much easier. They can kind of practice it, as it were, or they can give you the positive bits first, and then they can give you the development areas. And once they've got into rapport with you and got used to giving you feedback around something that's positive, then they're much more willing to give the developmental feedback. So I would always make sure you get both. I've also learned the importance of being vulnerable, and that is very much linked to feedback, because sometimes we ask for feedback and what we get, is quite hurtful. Actually, that piece of what you do isn't really working, and I think you need to think about ways to change that. But actually, that's how we learn. If we never change, if we don't allow ourselves to open up like that and grow, then we will just stay fixed. So actually, it's about getting the feedback, but it's also about putting yourselves in a situation where you don't feel totally comfortable and saying, you know what, I know this is the first time I've done it, or I'm probably not going to do a great job. Obviously, you don't necessarily say that, but you think, I'm just going to do this because by doing it, I'm going to grow. So that's really, really important. And then linked to that is actually having courage. It takes courage to put yourself into a situation where you're fearful. And I think courage isn't the absence of fear. It's about having fear, but doing it anyway. There's a very good book called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And I think if you haven't come across that, that might be something you would have a look at. I think about our brave doctors and nurses in the NHS at the moment. It's not that they're not afraid, and often many of them talk about how afraid they are of going into their roles, perhaps without the right PPE, but they have the courage, they overcome that fear. And that's another really important thing to be able to do. And another thing I've learned is the importance of keeping learning. Actually, it's very, very important throughout our lives to learn, and not necessarily just in one field. So I did an English degree and I absolutely loved it, and I did French as a subsidiary, and I'd always planned to be an English teacher with a French as a second subject, so that was all very simple and planned. But as I said, I suddenly realized I didn't want to be a teacher, and I had to go right back to the drawing board. And when I did banking, I actually took the banking qualifications, and that was fascinating because that included accountancy, law, marketing, management skills, all things I'd never done before. And what I found was how much I loved learning all that. And I think it's very easy to box ourselves in. By doing a degree, we necessarily specialize, and it's lovely because we're doing things that hopefully we are enjoying. But actually, I suppose I would just encourage you to just keep an open mind. Beyond that, you could end up learning all sorts of other things. And since then, I've done qualifications in coaching, in NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming. It's a kind of psychology for those not familiar with it, and also a certificate in applied neuroscience, as well as various other things. And actually, it's really interesting studying for someone like me who did an arts subject, and A levels were all in arts, to then actually do neuroscience. It was really exciting because I thought, wow, I'm doing some science. And I think it just means that we are not typecast. We can choose, and increasingly as we go through our lives, we will need to learn. And I think it's just having that openness to learning, because that means you are just going to be so much more versatile in your career. And actually the pace of change, it is a bit of a cliche, but the pace of change has increased through technology advances. We do need to all keep on learning. And really, it's also struck me the importance of both the inner and outer work of growing as a leader. So some of the things, I've learned, perhaps how to do a presentation or various things, how to communicate something. But actually, what is probably the most important, but the most personal, sometimes the hardest, is this inner work of being a leader, because people can tell who you are. If you don't show up as yourself, it's about being authentic, which does blend in this vulnerability, as well as being willing to stand up and provide direction and a framework for people. So those are some of my lessons. And as I was reflecting, interestingly, I thought, okay, so how does neuroscience apply to all this? So again, many of you are more than aware of the advances in neuroscience over recent sort of 10 to 20 years. Every year, things are changing, every month, in fact. And I was fascinated to learn about the application to neuroscience, as I said, but also then to think about, let's break that down. Which aspects of leadership does neuroscience particularly help with? And then I was reflecting on all those points I just said that have been the lessons for me. And indeed, neuroscience has something to say about all of that. So I'm just going to share a few snippets. These are huge fields, so I know I'm just scratching the surface, but I thought it might be interesting to link some of this science to some of the lessons that have really struck me. So let's start then with the neuroscience of relationships. We have a social brain. We are uniquely connected to each other, which again makes where we are right now tough, doesn't it? We are wired to be connected to each other and to be isolated in our own houses, particularly those of us who are on our own. That makes it even more difficult. But even just not being able to get out to the people we want to, we are designed to be connected. Our brains are very much connected and in tune with each other. And the neurotransmitter oxytocin, which you may have come across, is released when you interconnect thoughts, emotions, and goals with other people. So this is a neurotransmitter that you might have heard in the mother-baby bonding, but also happens with friends, with colleagues. So it's very much when we are interconnected with people. And so how do we get that right now? That's interesting. But again, I think that it can take place not just when we're in the same room, phone calls, Zoom. There is an element of releasing some of that when we're working closely with other people. But we also need to manage our own, other people's threat responses in order to optimize relationships. And I'm going to say something in a minute about this area of managing our threat. Ideally, we'll prevent conflict, or if we do have conflict, we can reduce it through the way we use our knowledge of the brain to actually manage our relationships. And as just a fundamental point about the brain moves away from threat and towards reward. There are about 5 times as many receptors in the brain around the whole threat and keeping us safe from threat as there are towards moving towards reward. So it's just worth remembering that we will try and escape things that we see as going to damage us more readily than we'll run towards something that is positive. So it's useful to think about that in terms of goal setting, etc. But that is the framework in which we work. So what does that mean in terms of threat? These are 6 factors that can cause threat in the brain. If these are not dealt with, they make us feel threatened, but also make anyone else with whom we are in relationship, whether that's someone we know very well or a stranger. Also, whether it's one-to-one or in a group or indeed a crowd. These are factors that our brain is continually scanning for. So they are status, control, relationship, certainty, fairness, and competence. So let's just look at those. We all need to feel good about ourselves. Our status needs to be good enough in our own eyes and in the eyes of other people. Now, some of these particular factors are more important for some people than others. You might think of some people that for example, for whom status is a really big thing. For other people, slightly less so, but it's key for us all. And I think this is one of the things that often causes conflict unwittingly, where people don't take into account other people's status. So sometimes we can say something that puts someone down. They feel their status is being lowered. That's bad enough if it's one-to-one, but if it's in a group, maybe in a meeting, you then get the response, you get the fight or flight. In each of these instances where the brain feels threatened, you have the fight or flight or freeze response where you can't move. So it's very useful when thinking about relationships to think about, am I managing the status of that person well? So it could just be something like, I know you've got a lot of experience in this area. It'd be really helpful if you could share that. That shows that you respect someone's status. So you don't want to put yourself down in order to raise up somebody else's status, but just be mindful. And if you do have a difficult message to give somebody, think about how can you do it in a way that's not going to put down their status. And the next one there is control. So we all like to be in control of things, which again, why at the moment, it can feel a bit unsettling. We can feel quite threatened. We don't know how long this lockdown is going to last. We feel a bit out of control. And often when we don't know what's going on, we feel threatened. And the brain really doesn't like change and lack of control. And so it's how can we find some more control? That's why if you run a meeting, for example, you set up an agenda in a well-structured meeting. And that actually helps the people who are coming to know what it's about. So they don't just think, oh, what's going on? When there could be an element of threat. So it just calms the body down. And often those people who feel most threatened are people who maybe work in a call center, something like that, where they have to ask before they can even just leave their desk at all. More threatening sometimes than very senior executives who can control some of the things, at least in their domain. The next one is relationship. Our brain is continually looking at everybody we meet as friend or foe. And so that's why when we communicate with someone, we might have a quick chat about something to get into rapport, even if it's about the weather, something really neutral. And then your brain can see, oh yeah, they're responding in a friendly way. Their brain can see that you're doing the same, and you both calm down. And that's not just true at the beginning of a conversation. It's about how you are, how warm you are throughout, how much you smile, that kind of thing. A lot of this stuff we do. naturally, we've been brought up to do it. It's not rocket science. What we're doing is just unpacking a little bit to think where we struggle. It can be useful to bring this to a conscious level of awareness, because then we have more choices. Another one is about certainty. We like to know what is happening. Again, this is what we're lacking at the moment. What is definitely going to happen, we don't know. And so the more we can give ourselves a plan, maybe you feel overwhelmed with how much you've got on. Certainty. Okay, I've got this on my to-do list. I've written it all down. Now I can calm down a bit. We don't feel quite so overwhelmed when we can actually see what we have to do, unless it's a very long list, and then you might find it a bit overwhelming. But the idea is to take some control of your domain. Fairness is another one. Again, we're very aware of children saying something's not fair, but actually we as adults are really keen that things are fair as well. And so in terms of maybe sharing work, that's an important aspect. So you're having a conversation with someone, making sure that you agree what to do at the end of a meeting. But even if you can't be exactly fair in terms of what you give somebody, it can be really helpful just to show that you're listening to someone. That is perceived as fairness. Somebody has a difficult problem. That is something, okay, I hear you have that. Let's explore that. Tell me what you'd like and work it through. You may not be able to get what you'd like, but the fact you're listened to is key. And then the final one is competence. If we don't feel that we're good enough to do something, we feel that we're threatened. So that's why it's actually very helpful to find ways of looking at it differently. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on, about reframing, looking at things differently. And it can be saying, you know what, I'm just going to turn up and do my best. I'm going to offer it as a gift. And I'm going to assume that everyone's on my side, for example. So it's ways to calm ourselves down. And that's one aspect. The other thing is do as much as you can before you have to do something, so you do feel competent. Do the research, before you do your written work, for example, so you feel confident and competent. So bearing in mind what we've just been saying about factors that might cause threat, let's think about how we might use that knowledge to reduce conflict. So that's to try and prevent it from occurring. But where it has occurred, we need to ensure that we address the factors, particularly the one that you think might be most significant. And sometimes it's worth thinking, which of those factors, the control, the certainty, the status, and often it is status, which of those things did I not handle well? And maybe it's having another attempt to speak to the person. And often they can be blended. So by asking somebody, how would they like a situation to be resolved, you're giving them that control, as well as showing them that you respect their status by inviting them to do that. Then they can say, well, what I'd really like to move us beyond this conflict, X, Y, and Z, and then you can talk it through. So they can be very, very helpful, those tools to have in mind. So you might like to think about the relationship in your life, if there is one, that you find the most thorny. Where is there most often conflict? Maybe you have some conflict right now. Which of those factors might be the problem? If you were to then go through and perhaps put a little bit more emphasis on that one, how might you help? And perhaps also then move away to find the direction of reward. How could you make it work? You might want to ask the person, well, what would good look like? You've got this conflicting situation. What would you like it to be like? And then you can explore the positive direction. But you also need to make sure you calm down their threat in their brain. And then one way of doing all the above is really having courageous conversations. And I think often in life we have difficult situations, and they are often these relationships. Maybe you're running a society or a group, there's somebody not pulling their weight, or there's somebody being deliberately obstructionist. How can you just take that person aside? And it often is better, take them aside one-to-one to actually think, how can I resolve this privately? Again, we've said everything's magnified in a group. So just a few thoughts to leave you with there in terms of reducing conflict. Let's have a look at resilience and the brain, another one of the key areas that's been important for me. Previous experiences of coping with stressors can help the brain develop redundancy networks. So what this means is that you will have had times in your life when other things have been difficult. So you actually then need to tap in when you come across a challenge to think about, how can I use that prior learning? And right now, all of us, as we're dealing with some quite unprecedented situations and some difficulties, our brains are trying to find some parallels, trying to kind of draw upon some of our ability from the past. And I think just know that you've done that. That can be quite encouraging. Know you have had some challenges. They may look completely different from what they are right now, but just know that you've dealt with some difficulties and you will be capable of dealing with it now. And highly resilient people who demonstrate emotional flexibility conserve their emotional responses. And one of the ways of actually becoming more resilient is looking at things positively. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But actually not investing huge amounts of negative energy in sort of fighting the current situation or fighting whatever it is. So it's thinking, okay, what might be the good within this? How might I be able to see this in a different way? Who could help me? What resources might there be? What friend could I ask? How could we brainstorm a way through this issue together? And you can learn. Resilience is learnable. And we talked before about the importance of our social brain, and social support helps the brain. We talked about the oxytocin, and actually it diminishes the stress response. And I'm sure over the last few weeks, you've all found ways of connecting with your friends, your family, just ways to get that social support so that you are able to deal better and feel more resilient. And those are some aspects of the brain, but other aspects of the brain as it is part of the body, it's really important to think about, are we getting enough sleep? Are we eating well? Are we exercising? I know we have limits around our exercise, but all those factors, are we actually maybe taking time to relax? Maybe some mindfulness, because all those things actually have an effect on the brain. The body obviously affects the brain, then the brain affects the body. And if by resilience we mean the ability to bounce back, the ability to cope with change and stress, and indeed even emerge stronger from a situation, we need to be thinking about ourselves as our whole brain and body connected together. And that will significantly enhance our ability to cope and our general resilience. And linked to that then is managing our emotions. This is from a very interesting book you may be interested in called Your Brain at Work by David Rock. He has talked to a lot of neuroscientists, and he is really a key pathway between the scientific aspects of neuroscience and the applications to leadership development and management and in many other fields too. And he talks about the importance of labeling our emotions. If we're feeling really stressed and very unresilient, if we can label what we feel, this can be really helpful. So to say I'm feeling really stressed, or I'm nervous, or whatever the negative emotion be, could be angry, probably not say it out loud if you're in a situation with somebody else, but even to name it to yourself is really powerful. Because this can be counterintuitive. Sometimes we think, let's just suppress it and pretend I don't feel this. Because if you actually do suppress it, it can make you feel more emotional, more limbic activity. The limbic brain is right in the center of the brain. It's the heart of the seat of the emotions, and also very linked to the threat area. It makes you feel more emotional, and interestingly, other people feel more emotional around you. They can sense, because I talked about this social brain, there are various aspects of their brain that literally pick up through what's called mirror neurons, pick up how you're feeling. So actually, far from keeping it a better situation by not labeling your emotion, try labeling it. And how it works is it draws the blood back from the very depths of your brain to from the limbic area back to the prefrontal cortex, which is just here behind your forehead, which is where your thinking, your deeper cognitive ability is. So we sometimes say we can't think straight. It's literally because the blood, or part of it, has drained away. So by labeling it, you're using some of the language function that sits in this prefrontal cortex area, and you begin to calm yourself down and begin to think straight. Now, that doesn't work for everything. Sometimes our emotions are too strong for that. You can try that, but another area is very helpful is reframing. And that means consciously choosing to see a situation differently. So actually, sometimes we can say, I say I'm stressed. I'm happy to admit to myself I'm stressed, but I still feel stressed. So then it can be really helpful to think, how could I see this situation differently? Good sort of open questions can be helpful. What might I be learning from this difficult time? If I were to float up to the moon and look down, how significant would be the stress that I'm going through right now? If I were to imagine myself a year's time and look back on it, how big a deal might this be? You will all have ways that you use, excuse me, to handle this. It's a tool that you may use. You may know that the word reframing doesn't really matter whether you know it or not. It's how effectively can you do this and look at it differently. So that is a really important way of finding a different resource. You may say, if it were my friend suffering from this or feeling inadequate about doing that, what would I say to them? And sometimes actually your friend, if it was your friend, you'd be a lot kinder to them than you are to yourself. Interestingly, the brain does not have a kind of a link back to compassion to yourself. Your brain has a lot of compassion ability to show that to other people, but it doesn't do it to yourself. So sometimes you have to pretend. You say, what would you say if your friend said what you just said to me? And actually, by looking at your friend, you're a lot kinder to your friend than you are to yourself. So there we are. So managing our own emotions, a few points there. We've touched upon creating a positive mindset, and that is really key. This is the definition here of mindset. It's a term we use quite a bit. But why is it important? First of all, let's just talk about the chain reaction that comes from our mindsets. If we think about our beliefs and our aspirations, this is what is possible to us. If I think I can do a good job at something, I'm probably more likely to be able to. If I think I'm going to make a mistake, I probably will. So whatever we believe, there is really a likelihood it's going to play out in our lives, because they cause us to feel, our beliefs and thoughts cause us to feel a certain way about ourselves and what's possible. If somebody offers you an opportunity, perhaps to speak at an event or to take on a role at university, and you think, oh, I'm not really sure I'm up to that. Okay, no, I don't really feel good. Perhaps I won't. On the other hand, if it's like, you know what, I'll give that a go. Maybe I will. I think I could do that. If somebody gives me support, I'm sure there's something I could read or someone I could talk to about that. You feel different, and then you will act in different ways. So how we feel about ourselves causes us to act in a certain way. And then those behaviors lead to our results. If you take that opportunity, that then may lead to something else, which may in turn have a really positive domino effect. Equally, if you don't take the opportunity, you might miss out on something. And really, as you can see at the bottom there, change your thoughts and you will change your world. Our thoughts are really powerful, which is why I call my business Thinking Choices, because actually often we just think our thoughts just waft through our brains. And of course they do a lot of the time. But if we can buy ourselves that millisecond to think, is this thought that I'm thinking helping me or not? Where maybe you're making a choice, oh, am I really good enough to do that? Really? Or is it should somebody else do that? Actually, make a conscious choice about what you do. And then that allows all sorts of other possibilities in your life. So a little bit more then about creating a positive mindset. Hope and optimism decrease the emotional distractions that affect thinking. The more negative we are, the more distracted we are in our thinking. So if we allow ourselves to be positive and optimistic, then that opens up choices again for us. We get the permission to focus on our goal. Right now, I can't quite see how it's going to work, but you know what? In a year's time, I want to be doing X. And I believe that's possible. And often we get put off because we don't know the route to it. But if we can be clear about the goal, we can then work out the route afterwards. And also studies from neuroscience have shown that people solve insight or creative problems better when they're in a positive mood. So if you have got some creative issue, whether it be a big sort of life choice or even something smaller where you need to be really creative, maybe it's an assignment, just think, how can you get yourself in a creative mood? And that could be simple as going for a walk or a run. And optimism is a gentle reframing, and to help us with a non-anxiety provoking vision of the future. So it's not seeing any of the negatives. It's not blind optimism. It's realistic, but it says, let's just take the better route that it might be. Sure, things might not go as well, but let's just try this out for size. And as it's quoted here, think of positivity as a brain state that empowers the brain to get to solutions faster. And this is another book that you might find interesting. the brain and business. So positivity is a really key area, and we do have some choices about how we see things. So another area I mentioned was important to me, and that's really helped my learning and development, is seeking feedback. And the two halves of this. Firstly, then capitalize on your strengths. Seek feedback on what your key strengths are. When I work with a lot of coaching clients, I say, well, what are your top 10 strengths? And they go, oh, I couldn't possibly, particularly the women. And I say, right, if you don't know what they are, then you go away and have a little think before the next session. And if you don't know, ask your boss, ask your colleagues, what are your top 10 strengths? They usually could tell me about 20 things that they're not very good at. I said, no, I'm not interested in that today. Today we're going on to focus on strengths. So think about that. What are your strengths? It's so important to know what you're good at. And then you can continually seek to improve your results by making more frequent or intensive use of your strengths. Leverage those strengths and explore how your strongest strengths can compensate for your areas of development. So maybe you're really good at relationships or communication, but perhaps you're not particularly good at organization or process or something like that. You might think, well, how could I find someone in my team? Maybe you're running a society, there's an executive team. How could I work with somebody there who's particularly good on that? How can I use my influencing skills, for example, to get them to work with me? So think about it like that. Just remember, we're never going to be perfect. So ensure that you maximize your performance through doing what you are really good at. So we could spend a whole lifetime working on other things that we're not as good at. Some things, as we're about to come on to in a minute, we do need to work on that we're not so good at, but other things, just make sure you are really sure about what your strengths are. So the other half of the other side of the coin then is working on your blockers. What's preventing you from moving forward? What are your development areas? And this is equally important. And seek feedback to help you pinpoint areas. And the more specific you can be on feedback, both the affirmative, positive feedback on your strengths and your development areas, the more powerful it will be, because then you can really work on those details. And then seek support on working on any mission critical areas. So some things, if you want to get to this place in your next step, maybe in your career, or your first step in your career, wherever you want to head to. But actually, I can't do that because I don't have either this personal skill or this knowledge. Just work on that. Ensure that you take the right training, or maybe get a coach or mentoring to help you to work on those areas. And remember, feedback is the breakfast of champions. Bit of a corny saying, but actually, if you think about an athletic champion, a sports person, they are continually seeking feedback. I remember watching Jessica Ennis-Hill in the Olympics. She would do a high jump, and then she'd rush off to her coach in the stands. He'd give her some sort of feedback. She'd then do some slight shift in her body movement. She'd go a bit higher. And actually, Olympic champions or athletic champions don't feel frustrated or hurt by feedback. They take it on board. Well, they may feel hurt by it, but actually they still see the value. And that's the whole point of it. Sometimes feedback can be quite difficult to receive, either because it's very much hits the mark and we think, oh, yes, that's a bit true. Sometimes it's also not delivered well. And we have to be gracious enough to absorb it and accept the value in it. Even if we don't agree with it, think, is there something in this that I could learn from? And this then links it, what do we do with this information? Are we going to use it to change or not? So the philosophy you have about human potential matters a lot. If you believe that talent is innate, then feedback becomes a threat. Stretch opportunities are dangerous and others' success is a problem. But if you believe that talent can be developed and intelligence isn't fixed, you're able to process information differently. This is David Rock again. So it's actually, if you really believe you can continue growing, it's so valuable to have feedback. You may have come across the fixed and growth mindset concept from Carol Dweck. The fixed mindset is where you believe that actually you can't grow and everything is fixed, as in the first paragraph there, but the growth mindset is the second paragraph where you actually can grow. So really an opportunity to ask yourself, what do I really believe? Do I believe I can develop? And neuroplasticity is the answer from neuroscience that your brain is plastic and you can change on anything. That means that learning can change the function, the connectivity, and even the structure of your brain. And right through our lives, this happens. It slows down a little bit as you get older, but basically you can continue to learn and grow, which is really exciting. And that just really reinforces the point there about the power of lifelong learning. Really, that's something I've learned about. Never stop learning. And, you know, some of it's hard, and some of it is really taking you outside your comfort zone. But actually, you will keep growing if you do that. And I mentioned about vulnerability. This is a comment from Theodore Roosevelt, former American president. He gave a speech when he talked about this, and I'll let you read this. It's called the Man in the Arena speech. So it's about actually being brave enough to put yourself out there. Do it. Pick yourself up. If you fall over, anybody in a leadership role, and what you're all doing now, there'll be some things that don't work, but give yourself credit for having a go. Pick yourself up, learn, and know that all leaders have to be vulnerable to be able to grow and develop. Hopefully have some supportive people around who can reinforce what you're doing, seek feedback, and continue to grow. And there's a book by Brené Brown called Daring Greatly, and it's actually really powerful. And she talks here about the ability to dare and be vulnerable. When we spend our lives waiting until we're perfect or bulletproof before we walk into the arena, we ultimately sacrifice relationships and opportunities that may not be recoverable. We squander our precious time and we turn our back on our gifts, those unique contributions that only we can make. Very tempting to wait till we're perfect. But she says, perfect and bulletproof are seductive, but they don't exist in the human experience. Rather than sitting on the sidelines, hurling judgment and advice, we must dare to show up and let ourselves be seen. This is vulnerability. This is daring greatly. And all of us in leadership positions have at times to go through that vulnerable position, dare greatly, and give it a go. Learn from it for sure. Parts will work, parts won't work, but try. So just really summarizing and drawing this to a close, there have been many things I've learned, and how interesting it is for me, and I hope for you, that neuroscience has something to say about all of those areas that are really key, I think, for our human experience as well as for leadership. So when we finish today, I would encourage you to just take a few moments before you launch back into the busyness of your life and dinner, etc., etc. What are 3 key insights that you've had from today? What aha moments have there been? What has linked to something perhaps you'd sort of thought or half thought, or maybe contradicted something? Maybe you want to explore it a bit further. What insights have there been? What might link to what you're doing right now? And following on from that, what are your key actions? Because something like this can be really, really valuable to you if you take it and actually do something with it. So what might you do from what has resonated with you? So I'd encourage you to do that this evening if you can. And then, in answer to this question, only you can really say, only you can write the next page. This again was going back to that Durham Light Festival. You may recognize just outside the marketplace at the St. Nick's Church there on the left. You are in a privileged position. You have got so much ahead of you. And it's so exciting. Sometimes it feels challenging, and particularly now, there are issues, but actually with resilience, you will choose that next page. And I wish you every success as you go ahead and write your next pages. So this brings us to an opportunity to have question and answer, and I'll come out of here and invite you to ask any questions you may like to.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That was really really insightful for me, because I'm learning from you all the time. And I guess one thing I'd like to encourage all the students who are listening to this is that, you know, that quote about Brené Brown and vulnerability, the fact that you are all in a leadership group together, you can share your vulnerability with each other, really, in a way, by learning. And that's what makes us a safe environment, in a way, to be vulnerable. So that's what I've taken. But actually, I wanted to move on just quickly. You spoke about many of key leadership, what was important to you and what are key lessons. And I just want to look at, the university has a set of graduate attributes, which I think I've shared with you. If you could just comment quickly, if you don't mind, on one of the key graduate attributes that best resonate with you, and why, while we get all the questions up from everybody else.
Yes, thank you, Chantal. It's a great list of graduate attributes, and hard to choose. But I think for me, the one that really probably resonated the most was communication. I did an English degree. I love communication. You know, the written word is really important to me, but also drama, the sort of the act of the word when it comes to life in that way. And I think that's been really key in terms of the way I've worked as well, both at work, but also with family, friends, because communication to me is very closely linked to relationships. And the way you communicate shows a respect, a care, a love for people. And I think for me, communication is something that I've learned and I continue to learn, and love watching other people communicating, because I think that's fundamental to human relationships. So I would say that if I had to pick one, that's my one.
And I guess today, even more so, that the need to communicate is more accentuated. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry that I couldn't join the talk earlier because of technical difficulties, but like from what I've heard, it's really amazing. Thank you so much. I really liked it.
Thank you.
I was really interested in the fixed and growth mindsets that you talked like in the end of the talk. Could you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yes, thank you, Ligia. Yes, I mean, Carol Dweck put this concept together, and it's really powerful, and it's come into all sorts of different areas, into schools as well. But I think it's really worth us all thinking about it. So the fixed mindset is where we believe that we're good at something and we're not good at something else. And that's often how we're brought up. Our parents, with their best intentions, say, you're fantastic at playing the piano, or you're great at football. And they say, you know, you're really, really brilliant. And you just think it's some innate talent. And so you keep playing football or you keep playing the piano. But when someone says, well, how about you try hockey? Or what about the clarinet? You think, oh, I might not be so good. And people might stop saying, wow, you're great. So I actually love the piano and I love football, and you stick to those things. And so you cut things down, and you look at other people and you're a bit envious because, oh, they're really good at those things. But you don't actually make that link that by working hard, you can get good at anything. So actually, people who believe that people have a growth mindset actually are those who think, I'll give it a go. And often it's where the parents praise them for the effort. And they go, wow, you really tried hard on that. Didn't quite get that goal, did you? But, you know, I thought you ran really fast along there. So what could you do differently next time? What will you build on? And then the child picks up, oh, actually, it's my own efforts. So if I really practice a bit more, maybe get a bit more fit, or, I don't know, practice hitting the goal or something, then they're going to be better. So actually, it often is to do with parenting that, you know, often with the best will in the world, parents sometimes get that bit wrong. But I think also it's probably not quite as black and white. We're not either fixed or growth mindset. We're probably a bit of both. Around some things we may be fixed and we think, oh, I still don't really want to do that. I'm not very good at that. But other things, no, I'm prepared to be growth mindset. But it's a really powerful thing, because if we know that our brain can reconfigure, even right now, while we're all sitting here, the neurons in our brain are reconfiguring themselves. And some of them won't last, but those that you think are worth it, as in those that you practice, think, oh, I'm going to do more of that, they will bed themselves down if you do it often enough and create new habits. So the fixed and growth mindsets are really empowering for enabling us to learn anything we want to.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for your talk as well. It's very interesting. You mentioned resilience there. And I just wonder, as somebody who runs a business, do you think we're sort of coming into a new normal for viability of businesses in themselves? And that as leaders, do you think that you sort of have to plan for your business to be resilient to a crisis like this now? Or actually, do you think it's about weathering a crisis like this, and then perhaps returning to what we maybe would consider a conventional normal in the long run. So I guess the question is, to what extent do you think there's a permanent change, and how as a leader do we need to, I guess, try and preempt or navigate that?
Thank you, Will. That's a really good question, and these are my thoughts in terms of what I see. I would say that we're probably going to have to, as leaders, become increasingly resilient. I just can't see, just from things I read and see around, how we're going to go back to completely how life was before. And even if we were to have much of what we had before, and goodness, I hope we do get quite a lot of it back, then I think we still need to be resilient. And by being prepared to be more agile, I think, and just think about how can we parallel process, but also how do we as leaders have to show up? So what does that mean for us? And I think we have to make sure we resource ourselves. I think it's very much for a leader, it's putting on our own oxygen mask first. You know how we go flying in those good old days when you could fly. You were told if you were traveling with someone who needed your assistance, make sure you put your own mask on first. I've worked with a lot of leaders who kind of forget that. So I think it's about doing that. But I think then once you've resourced yourself, I think we do need to look at what will the new normal look like? How can we be nimble and flexible and provide enough of a framework for the people we lead, whilst also allowing for change to go to happen? But I think it probably will happen.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. First of all, thank you very much. It's not so much a question, but it's just one thing to first say thank you, and then second say that I completely agree with the whole attitude of continuously learning. I'm now on my second career, so I did my university degree in accountancy economics in Portugal, and I'm now a languages teacher in England. So completely different, and it's just to emphasize how valuable it has been in my life to just continuously learning and keeping exactly the mindset you were talking about. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. And it's great to hear from you, Christina. That's a really practical example of having that mindset and the ability to learn, and because that's given you so many more choices, options. And I think that is really the way that we need to go forward. Thank you very much for sharing that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks again, like everyone's been saying, Catherine, for the great talk. I was just wondering, I'm about to graduate with my PGCE this year, but like you have decided it's not for me. And with each of the different turns that you had in your career, how did you know that particular one was the right one?
Thank you. That's a really good question. And one doesn't always know for sure, but I think I did a lot of research and just felt, I guess it kind of came to a gut feel. It was kind of head and heart. So I did as much research as I possibly could. I talked to people in the field I was hoping to go into, and wherever possible I went to visit the place. I learned, and I also asked people, what is the worst thing about this? What's the most difficult aspect of this? So I thought, you know how you look on Amazon for the bad reviews? I kind of felt like saying, well, what is the worst thing about this that you kind of wish somebody had told you before you went into it? And then I calibrated the worst ones, and I thought, okay, well, that's fine. I could probably live with that. I think that's really important to go in with open eyes, and also just to know that it could be something very different from what you were doing. So, and also you have to sometimes start really wide, because when I decided I didn't want to do teacher training, I was at Southampton thinking, I have really no idea now. I'm really back to the drawing board. And I went to the careers service and talked to lots of people and basically said, these are my skills, my interests, what could I do? So we did a kind of a fairly crude mapping exercise. So, and then some of them were like, oh, I didn't really want to do that. And so you then kind of work it, reduce it to some that might work, and then narrowed it down further. So it was quite a process of analysis. But then I went around the graduate milk round and talked to lots of people, and actually as much as that, then it was the people I met at Lloyd's, and I thought, wow, that sounds so interesting what they're describing. And I really liked the kind of people. There was a kind of a a sort of matching of my character. So I think when you go into any career, and certainly when any organisation, the more you can feel right in that culture, the better. So that was something that was helpful to me. And also, kind of in a sense, what's your exit strategy? You know, if you wanted to change or leave, you know, what would you get? Is there going to be some further professional qualification? Because that was important to me. Yes, there is, which again is quite marketable. So it's those are the sort of things I would suggest, head and heart, ultimately.
Perfect, thank you.
And Sarah, I really feel really feel for you, and I wish you all the best as you make that decision.
Yeah, it's certainly a difficult one at the minute, but as soon as you mentioned that, it was really inspiring to hear someone who'd gone through the same thing and know that there is kind of a way out of what you're feeling at the minute, and you're not just kind of limited in a box. You can go wherever. So that was really inspiring. Thanks.
Oh, I'm so pleased to be able to help, Sarah, and all the best.
Thank you.
You've given us your evening, and I'm most grateful to that. And just by the fact that we had so many on the call tonight, inspired by what you're saying and questions afterwards. So again, our great thanks, and thank you also for giving up your time to be a mentor.
Great pleasure.
As well. And thank you all for participating, and best of luck, and thank you for joining tonight as well.
Thank
you.
And all the very best to all of you going forward.